What's the hardest thing you've had to forgive, or never could?
My family's group chat was a mystery to me, not because I was bad with phones or uninterested in talking to them, but because, time and time again, they simply forgot to add me to it. That was the word they always used when I brought it up, forgot. Like misplacing a set of car keys or accidentally leaving the groceries in the trunk overnight. Not malicious, just an oversight. A simple slip of the mind. Over and over again. It started years ago with small things, plans I never heard about, updates I caught wind of only after they'd already happened. My older brother Greg got a new dog. I saw it a week later on Mom's Facebook feed. My sister Jenna hosted a barbecue at her house last spring, and when I asked her why I didn't get an invite, she blinked like a deer in headlights and said, "Oh my God, you're totally right. I thought I sent you the message." Must have been the other thread. You know, the one without the kids. That was the first time I realized there was another thread, and apparently I wasn't in it. It wasn't about the group chat, not really. That was just the clearest symptom of a disease I'd lived with my entire life, the slow drip of being forgotten. I didn't grow up in a broken home. I grew up in a home that looked perfect from the outside. Greg was the golden boy, loud and charming, always with a new hustle or project. Jenna was the baby, sweet and soft-spoken, and constantly trying her best, even when her best was mediocre at best. I was the middle child, the one who did her homework, who got into college on a scholarship, who left the state and built something real without needing handouts or attention. I used to think that made me the strong one. Now I think it made me invisible. When our dad passed away, suddenly, without warning, a heart attack that came and went in less than 10 minutes, they all leaned on each other. I flew in from Seattle, rented a car, and got to Mom's place by myself. They'd already picked the casket. They'd already planned the church service. They already had a goddamn slideshow. Not because they didn't think I'd care, but because, as Jenna put it when I asked, you were so far away. We figured you'd catch up. Catch up. Like grief was a treadmill I could hop on at any time. The moment everything truly snapped wasn't a big event. It was a Tuesday in April. I was in a conference room on the 24th floor of my downtown office, presenting Q1 metrics to a boardroom of men who didn't expect a woman like me to talk so fast, so smart, so relentlessly sharp. My phone was on silent, face down. After the meeting, I flipped it over and saw one missed call from a number I didn't recognize. And then a text from Jenna, of all people. "Hey, just a heads up, Mom was in the ER yesterday. All good now. All good now." Like a car battery that got jumped. I called immediately, heart in my throat, demanding answers. Apparently she'd had chest pain. Apparently it was a false alarm. Apparently they'd all been texting in the family group. The one I still wasn't in. The one they just, quote, forgot to loop me into. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the dash, thinking about how ridiculous it was that I was more upset about a group chat than I'd been when I didn't get a say in my father's burial. But it wasn't about the chat. It was about the fact that no matter what I built, no matter how far I climbed, no matter how many people in the outside world recognized me, applauded me, asked for my opinion, my own family still treated me like an afterthought. So I made a decision. Not in anger. Not in some desperate plea for attention. But with the cold, clear certainty that comes from knowing you've exhausted every polite option and are now ready to play by different rules. The following Friday, I met with a man named Carl who worked in ad sales at the Willow County Gazette, our sleepy local paper that mostly printed school sports scores and obituaries. I paid him in full for a full-page ad, Sunday edition, front half, full color. I sent over the copy myself. It was a photo of me standing in front of my office building, arms crossed, looking just slightly to the left of the camera like I was thinking about bigger things. The headline was simple, direct, and impossible to ignore. CEO. Not that anyone asked. There was no subtext. No explanation. Just the photo. The title. My name in small print at the bottom. I didn't tell a soul I was doing it. I went home Friday night, microwaved leftover chicken curry, and watched half a documentary before falling asleep on the couch. Saturday passed like any other. I did laundry. I answered work emails. I bought groceries and almost forgot about the ad myself, until Sunday morning, just after 7, when my phone lit up like a Christmas tree. First it was Jenna, then Greg, then Mom, and then 3 people I hadn't spoken to since high school. But what I remember most, sitting on my couch in my pajamas, coffee in hand, heart weirdly calm, was how not one of them asked why I did it. They just asked, how dare I? The thing about silence, especially when it comes from the people who are supposed to know you best, is that it doesn't arrive like a scream or a slap. It seeps in, slow and steady, like damp creeping into the walls. So subtle at first that you convince yourself it's just in your head, until one day you realize everything around you is warped and discolored, and somehow you're the only one who seems to notice. That was exactly how it felt the morning after the ad came out, as my phone buzzed and lit up and refused to stop, each notification a little electric jolt that confirmed what I already suspected. I had finally gotten their attention, but not in the way they were ever willing to give it freely. Greg was the first to reach out, of course, because out of all of them, he was the one who believed most deeply in his own moral authority, the kind of man who had always spoken in declarations, as if every opinion he had was some universally acknowledged truth. His text didn't ask me how I was or why I felt the need to go so public with something so personal. It simply said, "Seriously? A full-page ad? That's so dramatic, Mel." That was it. No punctuation at the end, just that smug, clipped tone that bled through even in pixels. As if I had thrown a tantrum over a parking ticket or made a scene at someone else's wedding rather than, say, issued a years overdue public protest against being emotionally erased by the very people who were supposed to be my foundation. Then came Mom's call, and I knew before I even picked up that she would be crying, not out of remorse or empathy, but out of the same muddled, guilt-tinged confusion that always bubbled up whenever I did something that forced her to examine the carefully constructed story she'd built around our family. She started the conversation not with a question, but with a sigh, an exhausted, wounded sound, as if I had broken her heart. "Melissa," she said, dragging out the syllables like she always did when she wanted to sound gentle but meaningful, "I don't understand why you would do something like this. Why you would humiliate us." She didn't ask why I felt left out. She didn't apologize. She didn't mention the group chat, or the hospital, or any of the thousands of ways she had chosen to look past me in favor of the 2 children who never made her uncomfortable. Instead, she talked about her church friends, about how Pastor Rick's wife had called to ask if everything was all right at home, about how she now had to explain to the quilting circle that no, she hadn't forgotten about her eldest daughter on purpose. It was just a mix-up, a silly misunderstanding, one of those things that happens in busy families. I let her talk. I listened without interrupting, because I wanted to see how long it would take before she said something about me that wasn't about how I made her look. I waited through 7 full minutes of her meandering explanations, her shifting of blame, her fluttering excuses, and then, when she finally stopped to take a breath, I said, "So I guess you saw it, huh?" She didn't respond right away, just sniffled. Then, quietly, "Why couldn't you have just called?" The irony was so thick I could have drowned in it. I wanted to scream, to throw my phone across the room, to tell her that calling had never worked, that talking had never changed a single thing, that I'd spent the better part of my adult life walking into rooms where the door was already half closed and still knocking, hoping someone would open it wider instead of slamming it shut. But I didn't say any of that. I told her I had to get back to work and hung up before she could ask me anything else. And then there was Jenna. She didn't bother with a phone call, too confrontational, I guess. Instead, she sent me a voice memo, 3 minutes long, recorded in what sounded like her minivan, with her signature passive-aggressive chirp that always made it hard to tell if she was being genuine or just wanted to get credit for pretending to care. "Hey," she started, like we were catching up over lattes, "so I saw the ad, and I just wanted to say, wow. That was definitely a choice." She laughed, awkward and performative, then launched into a convoluted explanation about how she and Greg had tried to make a separate chat for just urgent stuff, and how they'd assumed I was too busy with my company to care about the little updates. and how I never seemed interested in the day-to-day things anyway, and how they just didn't want to bother me. "It's not like we were trying to be mean," she said near the end. "We just figured you liked your space. You're so independent, you know? It's kind of your thing." I sat on the edge of my bed after that, phone in hand, staring at the wall like it held some secret code that could unlock the logic behind what I had just heard. And that was when it hit me. This wasn't just about neglect. This was about narrative. They had built a version of me that served them. Melissa, the strong one. Melissa, the busy one. Melissa, who didn't need anyone. It absolved them. If I didn't need them, then they couldn't be held responsible for not showing up. If I was the one who always seemed distant, then they didn't have to admit they'd pushed me away. It was all so neat. So tidy. And so utterly false. But now, for the first time, their version of the story was no longer the only one being told. The fallout came faster than I expected. Greg called again the next day, angrier this time, saying his clients were asking questions about the drama in his family, that it was bad for business to have his name floating around in gossip tied to some stunt his sister pulled. Jenna's husband apparently got approached at a school fundraiser by another dad who wanted to know if everything was okay at home. Mom stopped answering the phone entirely, which I took as a small blessing. And then, on Wednesday evening, I got the most unexpected message of all, a group text, this time, sent to me, Greg, Jenna, and Mom. The first time I'd been included in anything like it in months. Just 6 words. Dinner. Friday. Mom's house. Let's talk. It felt less like an invitation and more like a subpoena. A call to account. I stared at it for a long time before typing out a reply. I thought about saying no, about throwing their sudden burst of conscience right back in their faces, about reminding them that I didn't need to be summoned like a guilty party waiting to be scolded. But instead, I just wrote, sure. See you then. Because the thing was, I didn't want an apology anymore. I didn't even want an explanation. What I wanted was clarity. What I wanted was for them to finally say the quiet part out loud, and I had a feeling they would. And when they did, I would be ready. There's a certain kind of tension that builds in your chest when you're on your way to a place that used to feel like home, but has, over the years, morphed into something unfamiliar, warped by the slow corrosion of years, filled with unspoken resentments, avoided truths, and 1,000 tiny betrayals that, while individually forgettable, together make it impossible to breathe easily within those walls. That's exactly what I felt as I pulled into my mother's driveway that Friday evening, the sky dimming just enough to blur the edges of the familiar neighborhood into something ghostly, as if even the streetlights were uncertain of what this night was about to become. The house itself hadn't changed much in the years since I'd last visited, a modest single story with faded shutters, a porch swing that hadn't swung in years, and that same damn ceramic frog holding a welcome sign, chipped and mossy. Like it had been daring someone to throw it away, but no one had the nerve. Everything about it screamed stagnation, the kind of stillness that isn't peace but avoidance, the refusal to confront decay by pretending it isn't there. I sat in my car for a full 3 minutes, engine running, lights off, staring at the front window where I could just make out the shape of my brother moving in the kitchen, laughing about something. No doubt holding a glass of wine like he was already the star of some story he'd be retelling later. When I finally knocked, the door opened before I could even put my hand down, and there was Jenna, smiling too brightly, like someone greeting a guest she didn't really want but had been told she had to entertain. "You came," she said, as if she hadn't expected me to, as if my presence was some unpredictable favor I had bestowed on them, instead of a direct response to the very summons they had sent. I nodded, stepped past her, and let the warmth of the house wrap around me, not comforting but suffocating, thick with the smell of roast chicken and something sweet, maybe apple pie or some other dessert that was meant to soften the blow of what we were really here to do. Inside, everything was just as it had always been, and that was the most unsettling part. The same framed photos on the hallway wall, Greg at his wedding, Jenna holding her first baby, Mom standing beside Dad in their backyard in the mid-90s, smiling into the sun. I was there, too, in a few shots, but always at the edge, always slightly turned away, as if even in still images I had a tendency to be elsewhere, to not quite belong. Dinner was served with too much politeness and not enough eye contact. Greg carved the chicken like a man auditioning for the role of responsible older brother, cracking a joke about how he hoped I didn't take out another ad if the meat turned out dry. Mom tittered nervously. Jenna poured wine for everyone but me until I cleared my throat and she backtracked, pretending it was an accident. We passed dishes and made small talk, the kind of brittle, performative banter people use when they're trying to pretend that something isn't broken beyond repair. They asked about my company, which was laughable given how little they'd ever engaged with anything I'd accomplished, but I played along, reciting updates in a flat, practiced tone, watching their eyes glaze over the way they always did when the conversation shifted away from their orbit. It wasn't until dessert was on the table, a dense, too-sweet pecan pie that Mom always insisted on making despite no one actually liking it, that Greg finally put down his fork, leaned back in his chair with the kind of exaggerated casualness that only someone deeply uncomfortable tries to project, and said, "So, I guess we should talk about it." There it was. No one looked at me directly. Not even Mom. They all stared somewhere near me, around me, through me, like eye contact would somehow give me too much power. I set my fork down slowly, folded my hands in my lap, and waited. Greg cleared his throat. "Look, Mel. The ad, okay, it was a lot. Like, a lot. And we get it, you're upset. But was it really necessary to put our business out there like that? I mean, Jesus, it's a small town. People talk." Jenna jumped in then, her voice softer but no less pointed. "Yeah, and it hurt, Mel. It really did. Like, I just don't understand why you felt the need to humiliate us. We're family." Family. That word again. So often used as a shield, as a weapon, as a way to shut down conversation instead of opening it up. I looked at each of them, one by one, and the silence in that moment was more powerful than anything I could have said. But I spoke anyway, because I needed to, because I had spent too many years letting them write the story while I played the role of a supporting character who was only summoned when convenient. "Do you have any idea," I began, my voice steady but low, "what it feels like to be constantly, deliberately forgotten by people who claim to love you? To find out about your mother's hospital visit 2 days after it happens, not because you're unavailable or unreachable, but because no one bothered? To watch as every family photo, every celebration, every update gets shared in a group chat that somehow never includes you? You say I'm dramatic. You say I humiliated you. But tell me, how exactly should someone respond to being erased?" Greg shifted in his seat, muttered something about how I was always so intense. Jenna looked down at her lap. Mom finally spoke, her voice small and weary. "We didn't mean to hurt you, Melissa. We just didn't know how to include you anymore. You always seemed like you had your own life." That sentence landed like a slap, not because of what it said, but because of what it didn't. The assumption, the implication, that being independent meant being unworthy of connection. That because I had built something on my own, I no longer had the right to expect belonging. That they had mistaken self-sufficiency for emotional immunity. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I stood up, slowly, pushed my chair back in, and looked around that table, the table where I had once done homework, where I had once blown out birthday candles, where I had once tried so hard to be seen. "You didn't forget me," I said quietly. "You chose to leave me out. And now you don't like the way it feels to be exposed for it." And with that, I walked out. Not rushed, not dramatic, just steady, clear, resolved. I didn't slam the door. I didn't wait for them to follow. I walked to my car, turned the key, and drove off into the dark, not because I was running from them, but because I had finally stopped waiting for them to catch up. And the whole way home, the only thought I had was this: if they weren't willing to rewrite the story, then maybe it was time I started writing my own. In the days that followed the dinner, which I had quickly come to think of not as a reconciliation, but as a staged intervention designed to maintain the comfortable illusions my family had been living under for decades, I felt something shift inside me. Not dramatically and not all at once, but subtly, like a hairline crack forming beneath polished marble, silent and invisible from the surface, yet signaling something deeper that was slowly, but inevitably breaking. What lingered most in my mind wasn't the awkward silences or the performative concern or even my mother's hollow explanation that I'd always had my own life. It was the expression on Greg's face, that faint sneer of disbelief. Like he truly couldn't fathom how anyone could challenge the narrative he had clung to so tightly all his life, a narrative where he was the responsible eldest, Jenna was the beloved youngest, and I, the inconvenient middle, was simply too cold, too distant, too different to ever belong in the emotional fold they'd constructed without me. It became clear to me then that what I had taken as neglect might have been something more deliberate, something far more calculated than they would ever admit, and if that was the case, if they had, over the years, rewritten history to cast me not as a victim of exclusion, but as a participant in my own disappearance, then I owed it to myself to reclaim the version of the story that actually existed, the one with rough edges and inconvenient truths, the one they couldn't control with well-timed apologies or manipulated memories. So I started doing what I had always done best. I took back the narrative. Quietly. Deliberately. Not with another ad or any grand public statement, but with small, sharp acts that cut deeper than any confrontation ever could. It started with an Instagram post, nothing overt, just a throwback photo from my high school graduation, the kind where everyone is smiling, but the body language tells a different story. I was standing to the side, diploma in hand, a good 6 inches of space between me and the rest of my family, like a guest who'd stumbled into someone else's celebration. The caption read simply, "Funny how sometimes the distance in a photo says more than the faces ever could." I didn't tag anyone, didn't mention names, but it didn't matter, people noticed. Over the next few weeks, I posted more, photos of me in my office, headlines from speaking events I'd done, small moments that showed the life I had built outside of them, always with captions that hinted at a deeper ache, a quiet anger. Never explicit, but always unmistakable to anyone paying attention. One post read, "Built from scratch. Alone." That's the part no one likes to clap for. Another, "It's easy to be proud of someone when you feel ownership over their success. Harder when you realize you were never part of the blueprint." The effect was immediate. I started getting messages, not from my family, of course, because pride doesn't yield that quickly, but from people I hadn't spoken to in years. A girl I knew in college messaged me to say she'd always admired how I seemed so composed, so sure of myself, but that she was just now realizing how lonely that kind of self-reliance must have been. A former coworker reached out to say she'd shown one of my posts to her sister because it reminded her of how they had grown apart. Strangers began sharing my words, quoting my captions, tagging me in their stories. Somehow, without trying to be, I had become a symbol, maybe not of pain, but of what it means to own your silence, to weaponize it, to turn it into something that forces people to listen. Eventually, a local podcast reached out, one of those low-budget, high-engagement shows hosted by a woman named Patrice who specialized in family estrangement, grief, and the emotional fallout of unmet expectations. She'd seen my ad. She'd read my posts. She wanted to talk. I said yes, not because I needed more attention, but because, for once, someone was asking the questions my family had spent a lifetime avoiding. The interview wasn't flashy. We sat in a cozy studio with mismatched chairs, and she asked, "When did you first realize your family had made a version of you that you didn't recognize?" And I told her the truth. I think I always knew. I just thought I could outgrow it. The episode went semi-viral. People commented, people shared, and eventually, someone forwarded it to Jenna, because 2 days later, I got a message from her, short, defensive, and entirely predictable. It read, "Could you maybe stop airing all this? It's affecting the kids. They're asking questions." I stared at that message for a long time, trying to decide whether to ignore it or engage. In the end, I replied with a single sentence, "When you start telling them the truth, I will too." But the real shift came when I received an email, unannounced and completely unexpected, from someone I hadn't heard from in over 10 years, David Campbell, my father's best friend. The man who had once been a fixture in our lives, but had disappeared after Dad's funeral, claiming he wanted to give the family space. The subject line was simple, "You're not crazy." The body of the email was longer than I expected, thoughtful, carefully worded, and yet unmistakably honest. He told me how he and my father used to talk about me, how proud he was, how deeply he worried that my independence would be used against me by people who didn't understand that strength and sensitivity often come wrapped in the same skin. Your dad used to say that you were the only one who truly asked him questions, he wrote. Real questions. Hard ones. He liked that about you, even when it made him uncomfortable. I read that email over and over again, each time feeling something loosen inside me, something that had been wound tight for decades, a thread I'd been holding onto so long I didn't even realize it was cutting into my hands. I had needed that. Not validation. Not permission. Just confirmation that I hadn't imagined at all, that someone else had seen what I'd seen, felt what I'd felt, and could speak the truth now that my father no longer could. A few nights later, unable to sleep, I dug through an old external hard drive, a clunky black rectangle filled with digital dust, looking for photos I thought I'd long deleted. What I found instead was a folder marked voicemail backup, something I must have created years ago when switching phones. I opened it, scrolled, and there it was, a message from Dad, dated just a month before he died. I hesitated before pressing play, heart thudding, breath shallow, like somehow this would be the final word I never got at the hospital, the goodbye I never received. His voice, when it came through the speakers, was warm and tired. He said he was proud of me, that he missed me, that he knew it was hard being the one who always had to seem okay. And then he said something that stopped me cold. You were never the problem, Mel. They just didn't know what to do with someone who couldn't be controlled. I listened to that message 3 times before I let myself cry. Not because I was sad, but because, finally, I felt seen, not by the people I had spent my life chasing, but by the one man who had, in his own quiet way, always understood that my refusal to conform wasn't a flaw. It was my armor. And from that moment on, I knew that the story I was telling wasn't just for me anymore. It was for every person who'd been rewritten, repackaged, and reshaped to fit someone else's comfort. Because if history was going to be revised, then I was damn sure going to be the one holding the pen. There is something both liberating and unnervingly final about realizing that the people you spent most of your life trying to impress, trying to connect with, trying to please in ways both obvious and silent, were never truly looking at you to begin with. Not in the way that matters, not with the curiosity or reverence that we extend to those we cherish simply because they are part of us, not for what they achieve or fail to become, but because they exist, because their heartbeat echoes. Something ancestral in our own. That realization didn't hit me like a tidal wave. It didn't knock me off my feet in some dramatic emotional revelation. It came slowly, with a kind of weary gentleness, like the tide pulling away from the shore after years of relentless crashing, leaving behind only the scattered shells of what I had once believed was family. For days after I found that voicemail from my father, the one I now listen to like a prayer, not because I needed comfort, but because I needed to remember that someone, even briefly, had seen through the version of me my family had constructed. I walked around with a strange calmness sitting just behind my ribs, like my body had finally accepted that no reconciliation was coming, no apology would arrive dressed in sincerity. No overdue confessions were hiding behind the next phone call or text message. And still, I didn't feel bitter, not in the way they probably expected me to, but I did feel something sharper, something colder, not hatred but distance. The kind that grows when you finally understand that being invisible to the people who share your blood has less to do with you and more to do with the discomfort they feel when faced with something they cannot understand or control. I didn't post anything else online after that, not because I was finished speaking, but because I no longer needed to shout in the hopes that they would hear. The story was already out there, floating in the digital ether, carried in the mouths of strangers who found in my words their own quiet heartbreaks, their own moments of exclusion, their own memories of being left off the invite list or cropped out of the family photo or laughed at for being too sensitive, too dramatic, too unwilling to let things go. And somehow, through the very act of being seen by people I had never met, I began to forgive myself for every year I spent trying to be enough for people who only ever wanted me to be convenient. It was around that time that I funded the initiative, not out of revenge, though I'm sure that's how they saw it, but as a statement. A lasting imprint of my voice in a world where too many women like me were told that strength was threatening and independence was a wall to be broken down, not a boundary to be respected. The Community Tech Center was something I had been thinking about for years, a place for young girls, especially those with big ideas and quiet voices, to learn how to build their own future with code, with data, with confidence that didn't depend on anyone's validation. The building was modest, repurposed from an old grocery store, painted clean and bright, filled with donated hardware and walls covered in quotes from women no one had listened to in their time. At the entrance, just beside the door, was a small metal plaque, tastefully engraved, unpretentious, but impossible to miss. It read, "In honor of the ones who were never invited." I didn't tell my family about the dedication. I didn't send photos or links to the press release. But they found out anyway, as they always do when something touches their comfort zone. Jenna called me a week later, not to congratulate me or ask about the project, but to let me know, in a voice tight with resentment, that people were talking again, that Mom had been asked about the plaque at her hair salon, that Greg had seen a write-up in the regional business paper and was really disappointed that I would use something as noble as charity to make a point. I listened to her tirade with a quiet I had never mastered before, not because I didn't have things to say, but because I no longer felt any urgency to explain myself to people who had proven, time and again, that they were never interested in understanding. She asked me right before she hung up, "Is this how you want to be remembered?" The sister who turned everything into a message. And I wanted to laugh, because if there was one thing I had learned through all of this, it was that people like her never realized they were the message, never saw that their silences, their omissions, their carefully curated versions of truth were what left people like me with no choice but to speak louder, to become the signal in the noise, to etch our pain into public spaces so that others might not feel so alone. I didn't respond. I let her hang up. I put my phone down and walked outside, letting the late autumn wind cut across my skin, sharp and invigorating, a reminder that life goes on even when the people who were supposed to be your roots turn out to be scaffolding at best. In the weeks that followed, the messages from strangers kept coming, not in floods, but in steady trickles, like rain tapping on a rooftop, subtle but persistent. A woman in Ohio wrote that she hadn't spoken to her brother in 10 years because of how he rewrote their childhood. A man in Oregon said he had printed out one of my captions and taped it to his refrigerator as a reminder that his silence had weight. An older woman in Texas thanked me for saying what she had never dared say aloud, even after 50 years of being the one who always sat quietly at Thanksgiving while others spoke over her. And that's the thing about ghosts, not the supernatural ones, but the ones we become when people decide it's easier to live without acknowledging us. Ghosts linger. Not because they're angry, but because they were never given a proper place to rest. I am not angry anymore. But I am not quiet either. I don't know if my family will ever understand that the ad wasn't about them, it was about me. About reclaiming something I had let slip through my fingers for years without realizing it. The right to be seen, to be complicated, to be inconvenient, to be loud when I needed to be. The right to exist on my own terms, not theirs. Maybe someday they'll come to terms with that. Maybe they won't. But I'm done waiting. And if I've become a ghost in their version of the story, then at least now, finally, I get to decide where I haunt.